I would just like to present everyone to you. We have here with us Philippe Vanhuynegem, who is the branch chief of the fundamentals branch in charge of fundamental principles and rights at work in the ILO based in Geneva. We have with us also Professor Alpa Shah from the London School of Economics. We have with us right now also Dr. Neha Wadhawan, who is the National Program Coordinator for India based in Delhi. And joining us in a few minutes is Jens Lerche, who is a professor at SOAS in London. And so we will be, before we present the study, which is basically on understanding patterns of structural discrimination against migrant and other workers in some countries of South and West Asia, I will pass on the floor to Philippe to say a few opening remarks. Over to you, Philippe.
Thanks a lot, Igor. And it's a real pleasure being with you and to discuss about this very important study that the ILO has produced with the help of Work in Freedom program. Let me, in 5 to 10 minutes, highlight a few issues related to the work the ILO is doing and why we are doing it. The first item I want to highlight is in the title itself, understanding the pattern of structural discrimination. And the reason why I highlight it is that in the public discourse in general terms, when we talk about discrimination in the world and in the world of work in general, we talk about specific cases of the discrimination. Someone who has been fired for the color of her skin, for its origin, for being a woman, rather than analyzing the systemic discrimination that can exist in a society. And while we have specific cases of labor discrimination, which are documented in reports, and it's very important, those issues, the issue, if we deal with specific cases, it seems to be linked with practices of a few employers or the poor application, implementation, or enforcement of a legislation. And this is not the case in most of the situation, where actually the system itself is creating discrimination. And the ILO report related to equality of opportunity and discrimination that the Committee of Experts, and you know the ILO is a standard setting organization with this this ILS committee, including Committee of Experts, highlight the specific laws and policies that underpin some forms of labor discrimination at the national level. And that's the purpose of this paper, to present cases of discrimination and analyze some of the processes that shapes the laws and policy that underpin the discrimination. And that's really the purpose of this paper. So the second question I want to highlight, and Igor mentioned in the title I have as heading the branch of fundamental principles and rights at work, is that labor discrimination actually also relate to other fundamental principles and rights at work. You know that since 1998, the ILO, and it was amended in last year in 2022, has adopted the Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work on 4, now 5 principles that are absolutely fundamental. One being non-discrimination, the other one is the elimination of forced labor and child labor, on the possibility to create freely trade union and collectively bargain, and the 5th category of rights, of fundamental rights, being now adopted since last year, is the fact to have a safety, health and safety environment at the workplace. in general terms. So what I want to say here is that freedom from discrimination in the world of work is only one of the 5 pillars, is intimately linked with the other 4 principles. And in practice, we know that those who are more affected by child labor or in likelihood to have child labor or forced labor or to be at risk in terms of health and safety are also those ones who are more discriminated, and vice versa. So there is this interlinkages between the different fundamental rights, we need to be much more analyzed in depth. And that's what the paper is trying to shed some light on. It's not a paper exhaustive, but it lays out some of the key parameters that should be considered by anyone reviewing discriminatory work practices in connection, in particular, with those ones who are more discriminated in the labor market, among others, and in particular, migrant population. So the question here is what in the context that we have lived for the last few years, the pandemic in particular, to what extent the pandemic has affected labor discrimination of those migrant population. And I think that's one aspect that the study wants to highlight. We have seen, and that was a revealer somehow, that the pandemic showed or brought some light of how certain people in the world of work were absolutely indispensable, and some category of people were more protected than others. And that shows, in a way, the structural discrimination that might exist in the world of work under very specific circumstances. And the paper illustrates examples of how the 2019 pandemic and the different type of crises that came out of that pandemic had impact countries and people, in particular in South and West Asia, and have affected the population unevenly. And that's very important to shed light on those different type of population. So why migrant workers are more or less a victim of labor discrimination? We have the tendency in the media or the public discourse to link immigration, to link unemployment rate, and to link it with poor national economic performance. The paper that we will present today problematize such narrative and explore the process and political dynamics that shapes jobs market and the opinion about migrant and other type of vulnerable workers. So the analysis somehow is helpful in deepening the general understanding of the policies and the political process that underpin discrimination in the world of work and the people's labor mobility. And that's one of the issues that the paper is trying to analyze. So let me finish by explaining a bit the context in which, and thank all the authors that are here, and also the project CTA, Igor, for having taken the leadership on that paper. Indeed, the paper was produced in the framework of a 10 years program funded by the UK ED, which is called Work in Freedom. It's an ILO Development Cooperation program in a series of countries in South and West Asia. That's why also the paper focuses on those countries, which are India, Nepal, Bangladesh, Kuwait, Oman, Jordan, and Lebanon. And the focus of today's presentation of the paper is mostly on those countries. However, it does not mean that labor discrimination is more or less prevalent in those countries than elsewhere. But labor discrimination against migrants is actually a global challenge. And the paper highlights through those examples the problematic in general terms. So the Working Freedom Program was implemented, as I mentioned, during a 10-year span period since 2013, coming to an end in the coming 2 months and a half in March this year. And the paper that will be presented is also one of the several studies that showed or it was prepared under the program. The central goal of Work in Freedom, just to let you know what has been done by the ILO under the leadership of Igor Bosc, was to reduce the vulnerability to forced labor initially. But the project includes demonstrative field intervention in countries, both in origin and destination, but also in the transition, intervention to improve the recruitment process between the origin and the destination countries, and to tackle the root cause that underpin forced labor practices in particular, but not only limited to discrimination. So I hope that the presentation that will be done today and the discussion that will follow will contribute to a better understanding of those discriminatory patterns for the policymakers, for our social partners, employers and workers. And you know that in the ILO, the practice is to foster social dialogue to find sustainable solution on a long-term basis and systematic basis, but it also can serve beyond the policymaker and social partner, the UN organization and the ILO itself, about how we deal with forced labor, tackling the root cause through discrimination, among others. So thank you very much to let me have this brief introduction. I'm looking forward for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for this very encouraging and remarkable opening session. I would like to say a few words before we start, just to explain how this publication came about. First of all, this is one of many publications that have been produced under the Work in Freedom program. We have several publications, and in fact, if you read the invitation, we have a whole list of publications which we have shared with you, and I'd be happy to share with you as well when you, if you have any specific questions. But those publications focus not just on discrimination. We have a few publications on freedom of association. We have a few others, of course, on issues related to forced labor, garment work, domestic work, and many more, which are there. The report that we will be focusing on today started with a discussion that was held on in January 2020 in Delhi on the topic of discrimination in a workshop organized by the Institute of Human Development and the London School of Economics, in which various activists, trade union members and others were present, and it was recommended that ILO basically come up with some type of explanation of what are the more structural reasons behind labor discrimination. So I would like to acknowledge this initial workshop that had happened, which suggested that we do this. So moving on from there on, I would like to also mention before we start that one of the authors of the report, who is Miranda Fajerman, unfortunately couldn't join us today. She's traveling on an urgent mission, and so she won't be able to make a presentation. Unfortunately, that's the case, but we will look through that. We will present anyways the findings of all the report. Now the presentation we shall make is not one that is exhaustive. The report is quite long, and so I encourage for those who haven't read it to go through it if you have any questions. And some of the examples in the presentations will tend to focus on some regions more than others. But that doesn't mean that that examples for the regions that are not necessarily, the countries that are not necessarily always mentioned, don't exist in the report. In particular, there's country-specific references to reports produced by the Committee of Experts for the Application of Standards and Recommendations that is produced around this time of the year every year, and which specifically talks about discrimination and some of the other fundamental principles and rights at work. And so for detailed comments on a country by country basis, I would invite you to look to the country reports within this report. So with that, I'm going to start the presentation. So we'll have a presentation that we'll be sharing between the different authors, and then we'll open this up for questions and answers. And I will be the one who's hosting and sharing the documents. So if you just bear with me, I'll just turn on the sharing document, just a second. Okay. Okay, can everybody see?
Yes.
Oh, okay, great. So here's the outline of what we will be presenting, which is particularly focused on the third chapter of the report. As I mentioned, the country sections are very specific, so we won't go into those discussions right now. So there is a comparative analysis of discriminatory laws and policies affecting the world of work. We'll look into the international instruments, constitutional issues, the exclusion from labor laws and other related law and policy factors. And then we have another section which looks more into the dynamics in the construction of discriminated migrant identities, and specifically the political and economic processes that are driving migratory discrimination in South Asia, and how migrant workers feature in the formation of new labor hierarchies. And finally, of course, we have a section of recommendations, which we will be presenting. So to start with, this is a little bit to give you an idea of the legal and normative background. So we have here a few, the status of ratification of some international instruments with provisions to protect migrants and women from discrimination. The countries are listed here, and you can see that ILO's convention number 111, which is on discrimination, has been ratified by all the countries listed here except for Oman. Now, on the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, all of the countries in the region have acceded to the convention. On the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers, none of the countries have acceded except for Bangladesh in 2011. That's quite interesting. And regarding the migrant worker conventions 97 and 143, as well as the domestic worker convention, none of the countries in the region have ratified. So it's important to just present before we proceed. Here we have a, we're looking more specifically at the foundational documents, the constitutions of the countries in the region, and we can see, and we made a few distinctions on the types of markers of discrimination that are explicitly mentioned in the constitutions. So whether it's by race and color, sex, religion, political opinion, national extraction, and social origin. And as you may see here, you know, there some of these markers are mentioned and some of them are not mentioned. And you can see, for instance, in the case of Bahrain, they do not mention race and color as a marker of discrimination. Or Bangladesh does not mention political opinion, or India, which does not mention race and color, does not mention political opinion. And in terms of national extraction and social origin, the laws apply for Indian nationals, but not for foreigners, which means that anybody who migrates to India is is not technically covered by the constitutional provision. In the case of Jordan, you have also a few omissions, like for instance, sex is not mentioned, discrimination by sex, discrimination by political opinion, or national extraction or social origin. In the case of Kuwait, you can see that race and color is also not mentioned and political opinion is not mentioned. In the case of Lebanon, also race and color is not mentioned, sex is not mentioned, and national extraction and social origin is not mentioned. The only country that does actually have constitutional provisions covering all these points is Nepal, although it's important to note that they have a very new constitution, and that might be one of the factors that leads to this, but it's definitely a sign of hope. So, of course, we've listed some of the references here, and if you have any more questions, we can go into those types of details. Then we go, I'll exploring a little more specifically labor laws, and here we show how some examples. These are not all. We have other examples that are mentioned, but we're showing some of the examples that show the types of exclusions or omissions of certain types of workers or specific sectors from labor laws. So, for instance, domestic work, agricultural work is often omitted or excluded from labor laws. As you can see here, Bahrain, for instance, excludes domestic workers, agricultural workers, nannies, cooks, drivers, and security guards. Bangladesh specifically excludes domestic workers and agricultural workers through its Labor Act, even though specific policies have been put in place to regulate those omissions. For instance, the domestic workers protection policy, which has been put in place a few years ago, but does not provide the full range of labor protections that normally would cover other workers. In the case of India, for instance, workers in private households, including home-based workers and domestic workers, are not covered in the new labor code, wage code. Sorry. These types of omissions are important. Of course, there are some types of regulation, some types of legislation that do try to address some of these gaps, but the general provision enshrined in the law doesn't apply for these types of workers. Then in Jordan, you have, for instance, public and municipality employees, cooks, gardeners, agricultural workers, domestic workers, and garment workers. Kuwait also domestic workers. In Lebanon, you have the family enterprise workers, municipal service workers, agriculture and domestic workers, beauty salon and spa workers, and nightclub artists, for instance, that are not covered in Lebanon's labor code. So here, these are some explanations of the types of exclusions and omissions that come. Of course, every country has a very specific history explaining why these exclusions and omissions come. We don't have time to go into those details, but that history is definitely very important to consider in understanding those exclusions. Then there's another layer of which comes into place, which is the sponsorship law. And this applies particularly in the Gulf countries, but in the Levant as well. The sponsorship system, which basically means that the sponsor guarantees the legality in a certain way of the migrant worker in the country of destination. As a result of which, if they decide to revoke that the contract, then the migrant worker basically becomes an unlawful immigrant. So that's basically it, and it poses a lot of problems because it's often the main tool that is used to in terms of labor inspection, even though this is a migration policy. So here you have a few types of examples for different countries. They have, for instance, Bahrain, where you have a combination of regulations and policies, including the Bahrain labor law. For the private sector, the labor market regulation law, and the standard unified contract for workers that allows workers to remove the legal status of migrant workers through the termination of contract and refusal to renew the residency permit and so on. So these are a few examples. I'm not going to go into the details. I'm sure many of you who are present would be familiar with those types of sponsorship systems that apply in each of these countries. So I will pass to the next slide. Here, I think I will pass on here to Jens. Over to you.
Thank you. So I'm Jens Lerche from SOAS University of London, and I've been part of this study. And now, when we're looking at structural discrimination, and we've just seen the frameworks within which it takes place, if we're looking at the underpinning reasons for it, one is indeed historical norms and tradition that have a direct effect on work. In South Asia, a core to that is descent-based discrimination, where caste plays a central role in this. Castes are hierarchically ordered kinship groups that historically have, historically within castes, certain groups at the bottom of the caste system have suffered from universal stigma and discrimination. These groups were historically seen as untouchable. They could not be touched by others because they were, and they could not take part in social events with others. They had to be segregated. They could, even their shadows were seen as polluting because they were seen as ritually impure and a filthy class of workers that therefore were kept at the bottom of society, also work-wise in mainly hereditary, unfree agricultural laboring positions. Together with the indigenous people, they may make up today around 25% of the population in India, and so across South Asia, they constitute a significant group. Indigenous people are, compared to the untouchable, ex-untouchable people, a much more independent group. They were the groups that lived in the forest outside of the realm of the agricultural society, and agricultural society stereotyped them as wild, savage, or childlike. So they look down upon them in that sense. Today, these historical norms might have changed in a number of respects, but indigenous people and Dalits, which is the term that is most often used for the ex-untouchable castes, are still discriminated, both in general, but also for work. And as part of that, they are now also occupying the bottom of the new economies, the modern economies, very often as migrant workers, both international migrants, but also internally in the country where they are forced to work at the very bottom of the modern economies. In some places across South Asia, even the much more classic oppression of Dalits and some indigenous groups are still very strong. In other places, it has changed, but overall they are at the bottom of the work hierarchy. They are the ones across South Asia that continue to have the highest levels of poverty. They are disproportionately poorly paid. They work in informal and precarious jobs. We have a number of figures here at the bottom of the slide. I will not go into them in detail. Basically, there's enough evidence. These are from India. There's enough evidence to show that they do find themselves at the bottom of the work and economic hierarchy. It is also interesting, and that speaks to the structural discrimination, that they need better education to get the same jobs as other groups. And there are studies that show when it comes to white-collar jobs, there are overt discrimination in the application processes where applicants that have names that identify them as Dalits or Muslims, etc., are discriminated against. Yeah, next slide, please.
Okay, so this slide is about, I'll present basically, this is more to look into the Gulf and the Levant. So just a few notes on the discriminatory norms and traditions affecting the world of work. And this is more historical, and then I'll say a few words about how this links to the present day. But under the Ottoman rule, subjects were divided by the religion-based distinction codified in the millet system, which establishes really a two-tier hierarchy between a higher community made of Muslims and lower protected community made of people of the book. And of course, this is an important background to keep in mind. And then you had in the evolution and the construction of the modern nation state particularly in the Gulf, but then elsewhere, you had a sponsorship system which emerged from hospitality traditions that were adapted to cope with the inflow of migrant workers that would help transform the local economies to modern economies. So this is important to highlight because it explains a little bit how it creates it's a background as to how the different hierarchies in West Asia, in some countries of West Asia, have been created. Now over to back to you. This is to Neha. Sorry, go ahead.
Thanks, Igor. I think we've already started discussing how social identities historically have impacted patterns of discrimination that as they exist in the labor market. I'm just going to take a few minutes to draw your attention to regional patterns of discrimination and exclusion when we look at the category of sex. Now, in the regions that have been covered, the countries that have been covered in this report, across the board, we see that the male breadwinner model persists. And women are discriminated, of course, in the labor market, but also they're excluded from participating in the labor market. So we see a lot of unpaid work being carried out by women in South Asia and West Asia, and the invisibilization of this work, because a lot of this work is carried out within homes, be it home-based work, be it domestic work. And we also see that paid opportunities, when they are available, are determined by gendered norms. So we see women participating in sectors such as domestic work, garment work, sex work in very large numbers. We can also see that there's been a systematic and systemic undercounting of women's contribution to the economy. But this is slowly gaining recognition. And we can see that where sex segregated data does exist, uneven gender and work participations trends persist. So we have, of course, the low female workforce participation rate discussion going on in India. But across South Asia, for example, we can see that female workforce participation rates are much below 50% in any case, if they're declining or they've gone up. Now, let's look at the global gender gap in terms of accessing employment. And the ILO data, the report of 2018 shows that 26% percentage points is the difference in terms of the global gender gap in terms of accessing decent employment. And we know that in North Africa and in the Arab states, for example, women are twice as likely to be unemployed when compared to men, which of course increases their chances of being in forced labor conditions or working in forced labor conditions and not being able to access decent work. When employed, we can see that women face segregation in the sectors, as I earlier mentioned, that there are gender stereotype sectors that they are pushed into, in the type of occupation and the type of employment relationships that they actually encounter, which force them into further vulnerable forms of employment. To sort of just elaborate by saying that if we see the overwhelming numbers of women who participate in the informal economy and the types of contracts they work with, this is something that becomes very evident, that in terms of labor market discrimination, we can see that women, of course, find it difficult to access jobs to begin with. But when they do access these jobs, the terms of employment are really not up to the mark. Next slide, please. Now, if we go on further in this discussion to look at migrant workers, migrant women workers, this is something which has been brought up again and again in different conversations, which is there is really inadequate capturing of data on overlapping of reasons of migration. So to give you another example, in India, when the question on reason for migration is canvassed in the larger national data collection exercises, there's usually one reason which is recorded. And a lot of women actually report marriage as the reason for migration. But we do see, again, a lot of these women being employed in sectors such as construction or other informal economy sectors in an overwhelming way. So I think the reasons for employment or reasons of migration are actually not being captured. Also, the sectors where migrant women workers are concentrated do not catch the attention of policymakers because the data is really lacking in these sectors. Again, to give you an example from India, there's been a demand for a survey, a national level survey on domestic workers for several years. And this finally has been taken up by the government of India, but the data is still awaited. So while other sectors do have legislations, do deserve or do receive policy focus, why is it that sectors where women are concentrated in large numbers do not even have the adequate numbers, right, to start thinking about effective policy making? In terms of migration, we also have limited data on flows. There is some data on stock, but again, when it comes to women workers, it's really scant in terms of being able to, access this data at the national level, at the state level. These are challenges that we face. There's also, I think, in terms of short-term migration trends and remittances, we don't see a gendered approach to looking at this data at all. But we do know from smaller micro studies, for example, in Nepal, that women do remit up to, say, 3 times as much as men, especially when they're employed in sectors such as domestic work, because they simply don't have avenues to spend the money they earn at the destination. So I think these are all insights which are absolutely important and critical, without which I think data on women actually falls through the cracks, and then they are further rendered invisible for macro analysis. So the intersecting or overlapping identities, which in the coming slides, Jens and Alpa will be talking more about, I think further disadvantage women. So Dalit women, women who belong to indigenous communities, those who belong to minorities, are actually further disadvantaged in the labor market. And we have seen through our interaction with trade unions as part of the Work and Freedom Program and with policymakers, that these marginalized communities or women coming from these marginalized communities have actually borne a harsher brunt, right, in terms of the COVID pandemic and what it has actually met out. So I think it's really important to exhaustively capture these dynamics and these overlapping identities and how they impact labor market discrimination. And perhaps the best way to do so has been till date through meso level and micro level qualitative approaches. So this is really something to think about in terms of how we capture discrimination and what are the tools we will use, be it large data sets or be it smaller studies. Will we be able to effectively look at discrimination from a gendered lens unless we really think of the tools that we use to collect this information? I'll stop there and hand over to Jens for the next slide. Thank you.
It's Thanks, Neha. I'm going to take the next couple of slides. I'm Alpa Shah from the London School of Economics. And Neha, I think you've just done a marvelous job in telling us about the significance of the intersections of structural discrimination faced by women, Dalit women, Adivasi women, Indigenous women, and the need for us to look at all of these intersections together. In the next two slides, I'm going to further focus on the overall significance of this paper in really highlighting the structural discrimination that Philippe Vanhuynegem really highlighted at the start of the presentation. And I'm going to do so by focusing on Indigenous people in particular. And how we can't understand, the discrimination faced by Indigenous people by just looking at, the relationship with one employer, but how we've got to look at the kind of very structural processes that lead to the overall discrimination of Indigenous people. In India, Indigenous people are called Adivasis. They haven't been recognized officially as being Indigenous by the state, and they make up about more than 100 million people. We also have Indigenous people in Bangladesh, in the Chittagong Hill Tracts, in Nepal, the Janajatis. The differences between Dalits, the previously untouchable groups, and Indigenous people, Jens Lerche highlighted a few slides ago. But just in relation to the structural patterns of discrimination, you can see that in the agricultural plains of Nepal or also of India, where the discrimination is structured around land distribution, especially. So Dalits and untouchable people have almost no land at all, and so the caste-based discrimination is also based on land-based distribution, and this relegates Dalits to jobs which are really at the bottom end of the scale. When it comes to Adivasis, Indigenous people, they often have land, but the problem now is that they are being dispossessed of that land, and this processes of dispossession are historic. Of course, they go back to colonial times. It so happens that underneath most of the land of the Indigenous people, especially in India, are some of the greatest mineral reserves of the country. So you have coal, iron ore, bauxite, kyanite, mica, much more, and especially after economic liberalization, these lands have been basically the Indian state has been inviting multinational corporations of every hue into the country in order to get those mineral resources, which means that the Indigenous people need to be dispossessed of that land. They need to be removed from that land, and this leads to new patterns of migration, which are based on older patterns of migration, so what sometimes pictures speak louder than words, and you can see here in the pictures at the bottom of these slides you have these very rich lands, forests of Indigenous people in India, where historically Indigenous people, Adivasis, have been living off those lands and forests for centuries, foraging, hunting, and then you have the middle picture is a coal mine in the state of Jharkhand, and so you have these coal companies coming in, and the state undermining laws that protect Indigenous people from to have access to their land, and giving those lands over to various companies, and of course the last picture shows the ways in which this dispossession is happening, which is through brutal counterinsurgency operations. So you have structural discrimination in which the military is being used to the military reserves are being used to dispossess Indigenous people of their land. and civil war is basically, you know, you have a situation of civil war in many parts of central and eastern India, and these processes, I think you can see, maybe we can move to the next slide, Igor. You can see in one state, in two states, we have Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh in the middle. You can see these are the districts on one side, and you can see the kind of percentage of population, and you can see the kinds of development projects which have been planned. In fact, there are now many more that have been planned. We have ArcelorMittal, Gautam Adani, you know, some of the most powerful multinational corporations in the world, some of the world's richest individuals who own these companies, who are basically taking part in development, which is dispossessing. You have the figures for internationally displaced people, internally displaced people on in the far right column, and it's hard to capture the brutality and dispossession that's taking place. And then the people who are coming out of these regions are then being put in the bottom of the labor hierarchies in states which are in the states that they migrate to. So we will see in some of the later slides where the indigenous people end up in the labor hierarchy in the places that they go to. And you know, these processes are of course taking place not only in India, but we have similar processes in the Chittagong Hill Tracts. We have similar processes in other parts of the world as well. Okay, well, maybe we can go over to the next slides. Yeah.
Thank you, Alpa, for outlining the displacement of indigenous people and the processes relating to that. Now, for other parts of the population, an underlying reason for migration relates a lot to the agrarian crisis. As we have a quote here from a trade union leader in India: the sheer volume of labor surplus resulting from the agrarian crisis has never been as high in contemporary history. A move out of agriculture, labor surplus within other sectors arising from that. And in a sense, this is the agricultural side of this is in a sense a standard story, as agriculture in South Asia and in most parts of the world have modernized in the last 50, 60, 70 years. Then agricultural labor employment and the proportion of population living from agriculture have been falling. In South Asia, this has also taken place, and what we've seen is that the Dalit agricultural laborers, that they were at the bottom of the agrarian society, they are the ones that first and foremost have been squeezed out, and they have moved into seasonal labor migrations instead. They had to find livelihoods elsewhere. And that, of course, unsurprisingly, given the slides we had from Neha, is particularly the male laborers that have done so. What has made this worse is that since the 1990s, liberalization has had a significant impact on agriculture. In India, it led to an agrarian crisis from the 90s onwards, with practically zero growth within agriculture for a number of years, as the government withdrew their support to the sector, with investments in irrigation, support to input prices, etc. That led to hardship. And overall, that exacerbated the already ongoing decline of the agricultural population, which by now, before COVID, was around 42% of the population across South Asia, with significant variation, with particular much higher numbers in Nepal. But the situation is actually worse for people that try to make a living off agriculture, because most farming households cannot live off farming any longer. They have to, while they do their farming, also to also to work outside farming. That is in particular the case for the smallest farmers, and most farmers are very small. Average farm sizes in Nepal and Bangladesh are now below 1 hectare, and in Nepal and India, the proportion of farmers that cultivate less than 1 hectare are extremely high, more than 2/3 of the population. So significant proportion of people have to find some sort of income outside of agriculture. Together with that has gone a rise in unpaid rural women's work. Someone has to do the work, and it is the women that then are being forced to take up the slack to a large extent there. So displacement goes beyond what goes on in the hills and for the indigenous people. It's also this dull economic change that actually influence conditions of people and squeeze them out of agriculture. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Now that would be okay in a sense if there were good work outside of agriculture for people to take up. Problem is there isn't, certainly not enough. In India, it is quite extreme. There has been a direct decrease in the level of overall employment in society during the last decade, and this is before COVID. COVID would, of course, exacerbate this even more. This is well documented. These are official Indian figures. So there's a squeeze on employment. And at the same time, as within agriculture, women are being forced to stay there in a sense. There's no other work elsewhere, and they work particularly as labor, particularly when we're looking at Dalits and indigenous people. In Bangladesh, we see the same situation, gendered situation, and we see a continuous high degree of international migration. While there are some jobs outside of agriculture, it's obviously not enough to take up the slack. And the same in Nepal, where there's an even higher degree of international migration because there are few jobs at home, and gendered in the same pattern. As the Indian economist K.P. Kannan have argued, economic growth today is now decoupled from employment. India has had very high economic growth figures. It just doesn't lead to employment anymore, to additional employment anymore. And so growth is now associated with growing inequalities instead. Thanks. Could we go on? Now, what does this mean for migration then? And for discrimination of migration, especially of indigenous people and Dalits. Now, it's important here to just say again that what we're looking at here is both international migration and internal in-country migration. We do so because we think conditions and discriminations are quite comparable in many ways. And that is an argument we're making throughout the report. The structural discrimination hits migrants, both in-country migrants and international migrants. If just to paint the picture, first on India, where we have the most data, the actual numbers of internal in-country migrants, seasonal labor migration, we haven't got proper figures on that, but the standard estimate is that up towards 100 million or more than 20% of the labor force work as circular seasonal migrants. And they do so overwhelmingly in the informal, as informal workers, because workers in India are overwhelmingly informal. And within that category of seasonal migrant, Dalits and Adivasis are highly overrepresented. They constitute only 25% of the population, but 40% estimated of the total migrants. It is quite clear from official reports that they work primarily in low-end migrant job, doing what UNESCO have called dirty, dangerous, and degrading jobs, which locals do not want to do. That is well documented. So they work for lowest wages, longest working hours, and the worst conditions of work. And they do so because even if they try to improve their lot, they have to improve their skill set much more than other groups to get the same jobs. On top of that, when they migrate, they are actually treated as second-class citizens. Internal migrants are excluded from government schemes to a significant extent because government schemes tend to be tied in India to where people come from. So when they go and they migrate elsewhere, they lose their access to welfare schemes, to housing schemes, to schools, to healthcare, and they're also suffering from, unless they have local documents, from harassment and from police and other authorities. Essentially, they have very few citizen rights, even as internal migrants. In Nepal and Bangladesh, the situation is also that Dalits and indigenous people end up in the worst occupations, that they have very little access to social mobility, whether they stay locally or whether they work as in-country migrants. Thanks. I think this is over to you, Alpa.
Yeah, thank you. So, thank you very much, Jens. We're going to take a couple of sectors. So I think Neha raised the question of, how do we capture this? How do we study these processes? We're going to need new tools. And what we've done in the report, especially in section 2, is to take sectors and explore what happens within sectors. I mean, that's one way to go about it. But obviously, we need to take longer term historical processes. Somebody in the questions is raising in the chat is raising issues around the role of colonialism, for example. I think we have to take these wider processes into account and look through kind of meso level qualitative studies as well. And we need to complement, individual based data, large scale data sets which focus on individuals through looking at these kind of structural processes. And when we go to the brick sector, the brick factories and the construction sector, it's very, very evident. If you focus, for example, on India, the Adivasis and Dalits dominate the kind of most horrific work within those sectors. So here on the right-hand side of the slide, on the bottom right-hand side, you have the picture of an Oraon woman who is carrying bricks on her head into a brick kiln. And Oraons are Adivasis, indigenous people. This person has migrated over from Jharkhand, from central and eastern India, from those mining belts, for 6 months of the year into brick factories. And these brick factories are all over. This particular photo is from Uttar Pradesh, but there are brick factories in West Bengal. I mean, everywhere there are Adivasis migrating to brick factories in many parts of India, and you'll find those indigenous people then like carrying the bricks on their heads. You can see the conditions. No health and safety. You can see what the kinds of houses they're living in the middle there, and you can see there's indigenous people who are doing the loading of bricks, but Dalits are used to make the bricks, so they're both living kind of side by side in these brick factories. Construction is very similar. Adivasis and Dalits are doing the worst work. You see the picture to the very left is the building of peripheral cities like Gurgaon in Delhi, and there you have Adivasis, Dalits, also Muslims, very discriminated at and doing the worst kind of jobs in those sectors. These are seasonal migrants. Usually they get advances from contractors. So you've got this kind of neo bondage, what Jan Bremen calls neo bondage, like carrying on within they're bonded to those contractors. They basically have to work for them. Sometimes they may come back home after 6 months with a bit of money. Sometimes they may not, depending on the circumstances of the particular, contract they have with their contractor and the conditions under which they went. Of course, it's all under labor laws. This labor cannot kind of unite in any way to fight against their circumstances. Usually they're sent to places where they cannot speak the local language. They're put together with labor from completely different places. So yeah, it's, there are a few small unions which are trying to work with this type of labor, but it's very, 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 very tough work to mobilize, to organize in these circumstances. And yeah, you can, and Adivasis often, there are all these stereotypes which take place. Adivasis, yeah, they're the best workers, they don't know anyone, they don't negotiate, they have nowhere to go, so very easy to discipline, very easy to control. So yeah, very, so 6 months of the year they go, and then 6 months of the year then they come back to their, and during the rainy seasons, during the monsoons, back to their villages. But as you can see, as we talked about earlier, now even that is going to be not possible, because those lands are being taken away from them. So you're going to have like this kind of permanent dispossession taking place. So it's this kind of circular, we've got to look at these long-term historical processes. I think this is one of the points of the report, the kind of structural discrimination that is really necessary to understand in order to understand, the particular kind of discrimination faced by individuals. You can't just look at employer-individual relationships. We've got to look at these longer processes. So you see that very much, and we're trying to do that through various sectors. Big factories. I think the next slide, Igor, if we could go to that very quickly, is looking at tea plantations. That's another amazing example where what's fascinating about that is again, these are historical processes. So we've had the British coming into many of these territories, building tea plantations in the late 1800s, and for that, what did they do? They didn't use local labor. They took labor from other parts of the country. In Kerala, they took labor, Dalit labor, untouchable labor from neighboring Tamil Nadu, who then went and cleared all the forests and did all that hard work, and then were indentured laborers on these plantations. In the northeast of India, you had Adivasis taken from indigenous people taken from central and eastern India to do the same, clearing up of the lands and basically erecting the tea plantations, and then plucking the tea, doing the very hard work, which is done by women. Again, just highlighting something that Neha mentioned earlier, the need for us to look at the kind of intersections, the conjugated oppression of Dalits, Adivasis, women, the different kind of intersections through which structural discrimination takes place. And here now what we have is a whole new process as the Dalit laborers get mobilized in Kerala. They have started to get mobilized, trying to protest against the circumstances which they face, especially with liberalization, as there have been major cuts in what little kind of permanent work they could get, and what little gains they made over the years, those have now been cut back. And as they started to get mobilized, Dalit women, participated in this historic strike in 2016. They kind of basically mobilized and said, we're not going to work anymore. And for a month they went on strike. But what's happening is, when they start striking, what are the employers doing? They are bringing in more disadvantaged labor from central and eastern India, Adivasi labor, and they're bringing them over into these plantations and to take over the jobs of the Dalits. And that labor is, really cannot speak any of the local language, are hired only for 8 months, as opposed to living on the Dalit labor is actually living on the plantations all year round. They're just coming in for 8 months. They're one plantation 1 week, one time, another plantation another time. So it's completely mobile, footloose labor, and work harder, paid less. The Dalit labor is already living in like dismal, conditions, the Adivasi labor is worse. So, you know, you've got to look at the kind of intersections of how all these structural discrimination is taking place. Again, one of the kind of big points that we're making through this report, which you can, when you investigate a sector holistically, through both quantitative data as well as, you know, qualitative data, really living with these Dalit and Adivasi communities and understanding their histories. I think those are the kind of new methods that we really need to understand, you know, these wider processes of structural discrimination. Over to you, Jens, for the next two sectors.
Thank you. And these will just be two quick examples here. It so happens that Dalits and Adivasis actually also work within the industrial sectors, which is great, one would say. They have nearly as large proportion as other caste groups that are among the medium ranking caste groups. Unfortunately, they get the toughest, dirtiest, most precarious work, and of course they are all informalized. It is the case that the proportion of Dalits and Adivasis that work as casual labor within non-agricultural sectors is higher than that proportion of any other group. This is as an example from the chemical and pharmaceutical industrial belt in Tamil Nadu, which is an internationalized area with local and foreign investors exporting globally. And this particular case is from one district where the factory produced gelatine from cow bones. Now, this is doing that process actually involves quite dirty and toxic work cleaning cow bones. And who does that? The local Dalits. That is a job no one else wants. It is backbreaking. It's hard, and of course it carries stigma as well. Because so for good reasons they do that. Others won't do it. But when they protested, took up demands for better condition, higher pay, the same as we just saw in the tea bells happen, the employers brought in cheaper seasonal migrant Adivasi and Dalit workers from central Eastern India instead. And these workers might get formally the same pay, but they work much harder. They work more shifts. While our investigations showed that they worked up to 4 shifts in a row, 7 days a week, eating and they would fall asleep at work, take breaks at work if need be, but they would work as many days as they could to make as much money to take back home as possible with their low pay. And they outside work they would eat and sleep in shifts, sharing beds. Next, please. Textile and garment sector, to take one of the big export sectors from South Asia. This is a sector where Dalits and Adivasis are less present than other groups because conditions are in some ways a bit better than many other sectors. However, where Dalits and Adivasis are present, they are also at the bottom. An example here from Jain and Sharma from Gujarat, where their detailed work shows that Adivasis from the poor regions of Rajasthan, which has been deforested, and therefore Adivasis and deforested and the mining activities there. So Adivasis have had to find jobs elsewhere. They have ended up working, for example, in the low-end jobs in the sari cutting units in Gujarat, and they're paid a quarter less than other migrants, even other low-paid migrants. And elsewhere, Misatri has showed in Delhi that the Muslim workers fulfill the same position with the bottom-end jobs. And even in South India, where there aren't that many Adivasi and Dalit workers working in garments, there are examples documented of Adivasi women migrant garment workers from Central and East India that work under very harsh working condition and terrible housing, and are even kept under restricted mobility so that the employers can keep can keep control over them. And the photos here are of course of migrant workers undertaking their migration using all means available to get from their homes to where they work. Thanks. And I think it's back to Alpa.
Thanks, Jens. Yeah, I think this really goes back to one of the things Neha was highlighting in her presentation. When we look at the circumstances of those who are structurally discriminated and end up as migrant labor, what we've got to take into account is also the entire system of social reproduction, which enables that migration to take place in the first place. And that involves looking at and understanding the situation of how those households are run back at home, because essentially what is subsidizing that labor being in the site of work is all of that unpaid, unaccounted for work that goes on back at home to enable that migrant labor to be in the place of work in the first place, right? Because they need a home to come back to. So so this is a whole system of informal, you know, the invisible economy of care that involves the spouse, the children, the elderly parents who are keeping the migrants home running so that they have a place to return to, who are caring for the migrant in the old age when they're no longer fit for work, who are caring for the migrant worker when there is no work, and you know, and also the systems of land, forest, livelihoods that provide a livelihood for the skin at home in the villages through their life cycle. And this is what is allowing the employers, whether it is in the factories, in the kilns, or the construction sites, to pay that seasonal migrant so little, make them so cheap to employ. So you cannot understand that structural discrimination which is taking place, you know, in the workplace without understanding all of these things which are kind of hidden behind the, you know, behind that individual being able to migrate. So what we're trying to draw attention to is the very, you know, the long-term bigger structural processes which involve especially what's happening within the household as central to the processes of discrimination that we need to understand in order to understand the patterns of structural discrimination in the labor market. Okay.
Thanks. Now, if we take one step back from the examples now and look at other aspects that maintains discrimination, structural discrimination in the labor market, then it is quite clear that part of that is the discriminatory public discourse regarding migrant workers and government policies that keep that disenfranchise migrant workers, and that is part of what have formed these labor hierarchies with migrant workers at the bottom of the hierarchy. And if we should take just a couple of government policies that do reinforce and maintain structural discrimination. One is policies where the proper jobs, the permanent jobs, the non-informalized jobs often are reserved by law for the dominant natives. That is the case in the Middle East. In many countries, migrant workers are doing certain kind of jobs. It's also the case, for example, in India, where states in India enact legislation to reserve the good jobs for what they call the sons of the soil. Apologies for the gendered expression, but that is an expression that is often used. I think it's 6 or 7 states in India that have legislation where they reserve a significant part of the good jobs for the people of that state. And that, of course, means migrant laborers are excluded and have to take up the worst job. It's also the case that, as I've highlighted before that governments do treat seasonal migrants as second-class citizens in many ways. The states in India, and one could also discuss this in relation to the Middle East, where citizen rights are not extended to migrant workers. That also enforces structural discrimination. But it's of course not only that, it is also local workers actively collude with this kind of discrimination. They are also happy for their reservation, for their own groups, and often that kind of collusion goes also along lines of caste and religion, even within workplaces. There are even recurring atrocities against migrants, where migrants can be accused for all sorts of crimes, and therefore they can be hounded out. It happens quite often. It is recurring in India over the years, and there are many examples of that. It could be so. If we're looking at the way the hierarchy, labor migrant hierarchies then are organized, there are also clear levels and hierarchies among migrant workers. Just to start the discussion of that, one can look at the role of labor contractors. Labor contractors, it is their job to labor recruitment agencies, it is their job to sell their workers to employers, and they will codify them. There are some wonderful examples in our report, wonderful because they are so evocative of how in the Middle East labor recruitment agencies might or do sometimes announce, we have domestic workers from this nationality, from that nationality, with their own characteristics. These groups are strong and demanding. These are famous for escaping, so you've got to take care if you employ them. So this kind of segregation and according to characteristics that are discursively put forward are quite common. It is also the case that labor contractors for in-country seasonal migrants organize different groups for different jobs. In India, for example, it is very often so that for security guards, those jobs go to the dominant caste or even Brahmins, whereas Dalits and Adivasis and other low-ranking groups get the low-end jobs. Of course, it is not, one can't just blame the labor contractors. The labor contractors do this because employers want certain things. So employers want certain categories, social categories of workers with certain characteristics. So they fulfill that need in a sense. And similarly, it is also where the workers come and want the jobs, because the worst of migrants from the lowest, from the most discriminated groups know, of course, that they will have to accept the worst conditions in order to get a job. So it all works where in the labor market, where the different actors consolidate these kind of hierarchies. Okay, so overall, I think it's fairly clear that we are looking at overall structural discrimination where that are based on descent-based discrimination. Dalits, Adivasis, and indigenous people, women are consistently at the bottom of the social and economic hierarchies, also in the modern economy. This doesn't seem to go away with modernization. It seems to be transformed into new ways of maintaining structural discrimination. Thank you. So,
and just to summarize some of the points, I mean, I think a lot has been said, but we have mentioned some of the unequal laws, how they basically exclude or omit certain types of occupations, or particularly migrant workers. We have mentioned discriminatory policies or unequal policies, norms as well. And then we have looked at how different types of populations are displaced within their home communities, particularly Adivasis, indigenous populations, and the different types of sex discrimination, gender biases that occur in discrimination, which Neha presented, And then the agrarian crisis, a very important factor which drives migration in South Asia, but also in other parts of the world that we could also look into in other publications. And then you have, of course, the unemployment and unavailability of jobs, which is a major factor. And then that basically is layered up with a discourse that prioritizes nationals and sidelines migrant workers in spite of employers' preferences to hire migrant workers under substandard conditions. So often the discourse stigmatizes the worker, but the employers prefer to hire the migrant worker because they can get away through different contracting arrangements, through to give them less beneficial protections. And then, of course, you have the sponsoring system, you have the histories of migration and the hierarchies of labor that are formed. I think we could have said a lot more about, particularly in West Asia and the Gulf, how different hierarchies exist. For instance, just to take the example of domestic works with Filipinos who entered the labor market at the very beginning, who are treated differently than those who are more recent entrants into the labor market. For instance, Bangladeshis or other or Burmese workers who basically often are. So there's these hierarchies where you have different migrant workers from different countries who are paid more to do similar types of work in different types of hierarchies. So that's important, and we find the same thing. I mean, just as also, I think it was Jens and Alpa mentioned the garment sector. The garment sector, for instance, in a place like Jordan, we have recently just published a study where we show how there is significant wage gaps between migrant worker populations and local workers. And we also know from experience of the Work and Freedom program how the labor market is very much layered with different types of workers, whether they're from India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, and so on, working in different types of positions. And even the caste issue, which in India is important, is somehow reproduced in the garment sector in Jordan, where you have some, particularly the tailoring caste, who end up taking Muslims and sometimes in Hindu tailoring caste, who end up doing much of the work there, particularly at the machine operator level. So I think these are important hierarchies that are important to note. Just a few. So very quickly, I mean, we're coming to the end. So just a few recommendations, and I think many of these recommendations are inspired from the discussions that we had 3 years ago in Delhi. But here are a few related to the economic laws and policy. So very important is to introduce comprehensive measures to address the agrarian crisis. In India particularly, there was a government report, often referred to as the Swaminathan report. I won't give the full name, but that's how it's usually referred. That gave a lot of, was very comprehensive and had several recommendations. So, you know, this is, I think following those recommendations would be very important, and also preventing the takeover of land and forests from indigenous and other populations. Looking into the privatization of the commons, such as public lands, forests, and water resources, to make sure that the indigenous populations are not dispossessed, and privatization doesn't basically affect these areas in general. Then second, also very important to demilitarize resource-rich and other areas that are home to Adivasi and other native populations. As was mentioned, as Alpa mentioned, some of these particular districts in, for instance, Chhattisgarh, but also Jharkhand, Odisha, and East India are militarized. So it's important to to demilitarize so that you have normal process of development and not some sort of a resource grabbing process. Third point is to introduce comprehensive measures to address the job crisis and reconstruct the productive local economy. Like, for instance, expanding the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, or what is in Nepal rephrased as the Prime Minister Employment Program, and other urban job guarantee programs. The fourth is to strengthen and expand social protection functions of the states in education, healthcare protection, land, forest rights, and other comments. And finally, migrant workers were among the most affected populations in the COVID pandemic. So it's important to stop the practice of suspending the application of labor laws that protect them, a practice that did happen during the pandemic. And then, so here we have a few recommendations on inclusion policies for labor migrants. So extend and implement the rights to freedom of association and collective bargaining to all migrant workers. Also ensure and enforce equal labor rights for all workers, remove exceptions and include excluded workers such as domestic workers or agricultural workers, boost labor inspection, and ensure that access to justice is possible for the most commonly discriminated against migrant workers. So also important to introduce laws and policies to make principal employers accountable for working and living conditions of their employees, ensure that outsourcing and subcontracting processes are not used to avoid making employers and contractors accountable for working and living conditions of their employers. We did not mention during the presentation contract law, but contract law is a very important, I mean, it could have taken a whole book to write about this, but it's a very important factor that explains discrimination because it allows, I mean, I think Jens did mention and Alpa did mention a little bit about contractors, but I think in general how contract law has been applied throughout in most countries is an important factor that explains discriminatory practices. Ensuring equal welfare rights for all with special governance provisions to bar exclusions, extend welfare provisions, provisions to seasonal migrants, including access to public distribution systems, portable social security, schooling rights, and housing rights, and introducing special measures to prevent employers from abusing workers, forcing them to undertake personal services in addition to regular ones. So here, these are some recommendations on inclusion policies for migrant workers. In terms of migrant workers and their work, it's important to remove work and mobility bans for specific groups, like bans on the women's migration, which is something that exists in Nepal, or sectors specifically, like for instance, related to sex work. It's important to review discriminatory migration regimes and labor hierarchies, like the kafala system, and regulate discriminatory policies by labor intermediaries employers, which I just mentioned. And finally, looking at more specific types of recommendations, strengthen anti-discrimination measures as per ILO Conventions 111 on discrimination or 169 on indigenous workers, with checks and balances such as including discriminated groups in the governance of justice. So examples of good affirmative action programs can be provided. Strengthen and enforce policies against gender-based violence affecting migrant populations according to the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women and the Commission of the Status of Women's Recommendations. So, and finally, introduce governance reforms to establish checks and balances so that discriminatory public discourses, hate speech, and violence against workers are prevented. These are some general recommendations. On a more specific country level, we have specific recommendations which are taken from the Committee of Experts for the Application of Standards and Recommendations. So for those country-specific recommendations, we invite you to look in the report to those specific sections. So I'll leave it there and I'll stop sharing just a second. There you go. And now we're gonna open up for questions. I understand that many of the questions have been already asked here. But maybe we can take a few, we will answer the questions which are in the chat box. But in addition to those, maybe some of you would like to ask specific questions. Please give your name and the institution you represent, and then pose your question or comment. Over to you. We have, I think, less than half an hour left, so not much time, but we hope to be able to answer your questions. Over to you.
Igor, I think there are some questions in the chat box, in the Q&A box, as well as in the chat. I can see two questions from Asanja Ranasinghe and from Christian Wolf. So maybe you'd like to read out those questions, and then we could take responses.
Okay, so how has colonization impacted patterns of structural discrimination in South Asia? And has the study found specific impact of discrimination on access to international migration for these marginalized groups? Are they less able to migrate abroad, or is migration concentrated in specific sectors? So let's start with the question on the impact of colonization. I would ask maybe Alpa and Jens to answer that. And regarding Christian's question, we will then maybe Neha or I can answer those. So over to you, Alpa.
Yeah, it's massive. It's such an important point, right? About colonization and the persistence of it, in today's times. I mean, if you look at the Indian case, of course, there have been big debates about, whether caste was actually a colonial creation. Nick Dirks was one of the people that argued that. I think that there's now enough evidence to show that that's not the case, that of course there was caste hierarchies before colonial times, but that colonization perhaps rigidified the caste structure in new ways by bureaucratizing it. But also colonization, as we, in the examples that we gave, it's been the processes, the sectors that we see and how they've developed. For example, the tea plantations. You can't look at what's happening today in today's tea plantation sector without looking at the history of how those plantations were created in the first place. Jason and Raj, whose work we used a lot in the report, is basically arguing for the need for us to look at the persistence of plantations and the abolition of plantations now, and that links to the colonial project of the creation of plantations. With the mining sector as well, the histories of these labor histories of the history of mining goes back to colonial times, but there are new forms of it now. With liberalization, we've got who are the current neo-colonialists or colonialists, as you could put it. I think one of you I think maybe it was I think it was you who mentioned Asanga, who mentioned looking at who are the richest people in the world, and the world's third richest man according to the internet. I mean, Gautam Adani is like one of the world's the richest man in Asia, and he is responsible for mining in the Hasdewarant forest, the creation of a massive thermal sector plant in a thermal power plant in Jharkhand. And these are this is what is dispossessing Adivasis from Jharkhand into and Chhattisgarh into other parts of the country. So we've got to look at what we've called in a paper, Jens and I, also processes of new internal, the persistence of internal colonialism, where you have new Indian elites who are reproducing the processes of colonialism in new ways, and you have parts of the country which are internally colonized by other parts of the country. And this is really central to understanding how migration is taking place and how we understand structural discrimination and its relationship to migration. So you're so right. I think Sujata Modi, just to take up something that she points out, is like she's asking, well, we need to ask these questions of, who is this development for? This is a question that is never asked. And it goes back to, the wider inequalities. Who is creating these processes? Who are these thermal plants for? Who is the mining for? And what is actually happening to the people whose land and whose labor it is abusing and exploiting and dispossessing? Yeah.
Should I just add here?
Sure, please.
Yes, so I couldn't agree more with what Alpa just said, but let me just add to the colonial history and that history, of course, is reflected also in the way labor contractors work today. That goes certainly back to colonial times, and migration started, or certainly did take place during colonial time as well. So there are long histories here. It is also the case that the informalization of labor in the modern sectors is a much more recent phenomenon. That was less common up until the 1980s, beginning of the 1990s. So there has been a very strong change in the way the so-called modern sectors operate within the last 30 years, with liberalization, with the change of laws allowing for informalized labor to have a much bigger presence in modern factories, etc., etc. Now that, of course, is being lauded by some because it helps create growth and profits that can be invested, and maybe if they were invested properly, it could lead to improvement of society as such. It does, however, also enable exploitation of the most discriminated groups, and I guess that is what one sees with that it is the structurally discriminated groups that then do end up in those jobs that are the worst and that have been created within the modern economy relatively recently, historically speaking, relatively recently. So I guess that is also in part an answer to the question of who is development for. Should we call this modern? I'm using these terms because those are the standard terms used. And of course, one will have to make a normative judgment of that as what one wants to. I think I will restrict myself to point out that it does enable structural discrimination of the most vulnerable groups, as I think we've shown here.
Okay, just to, unless Neha, you would like to say a few words on the question regarding the restrictions on migration. For instance, I can think of particularly migration bans for women, which are a form of restriction that has happened. It is mentioned in the report, although we have other reports that detail this type of practice in more depth. Maybe Neha, you want to say some words on that, or should we go on to some of the other questions?
Sure, no, I'd be happy to respond to that, Igor.
Sure.
Thanks, Christian, for that very interesting question. And I know that, while a lot of the examples that we've used today, especially based on the presentation, that Jens and Alpa have done, draw upon more sort of the internal migration question, right, in India. But I think there's similar patterns one can observe in the case of international migration too. And I'm going to speak specifically from our experience of working with trade unions in Kerala and in Andhra Pradesh, where they've been trying to work with in areas or pockets where large numbers of women migrate for domestic work overseas from, right? Now, it's interesting to see that I think earlier, the impression was that Dalits, Adivasis, backward communities could not participate in international migration as much. It's interesting that when we look at the question of religion, we do see different patterns. So it's not as if minorities didn't migrate internationally. I think into certain sectors in certain countries, there were patterns that have existed for a long time. But when we look at domestic work, I think the interesting thing to note is that a lot of women who are migrating as domestic workers do come from these marginalized backgrounds. Now, in Kerala, it's a little different. We saw a lot more Adivasi or indigenous groups being represented in this pattern. If you look at nurse migration again, there's a very interesting pattern there, where it may not be the lowest of those in the social hierarchy, but those who are sort of more in the center because they do have access to education and other forms of access, which will then enable them to skill themselves and migrate for certain types of work. But in Andhra Pradesh, very interestingly, and I had the opportunity to spend some time with the communities and the organizers that we were working with. It's really interesting to see how, because of the local land relationships, right, and the fact that Dalits and Adivasis and OBCs didn't have access to much land, they were forced to work in bondage conditions, in agricultural work. And these communities have now turned away from working in agricultural labor, and instead the women from these communities are migrating for domestic work. So I think it's really interesting to see debt patterns and how they connect in terms of certain marginalized communities accessing international migration. But one could, I think, say this with some level of certainty, I think, that upper castes and those who are higher up in the social hierarchy do access better jobs, better training, better employment opportunities, better pay, right, when they migrate abroad. Whereas those who are lower down in the social hierarchy are then also getting channelized into precarious work or less than decent work. So I think those patterns are very clear. It's a good question, to then also think about why they're opting out of working in less than decent conditions in their own country and wanting to do that when they migrate abroad, right? I mean, what is the cost benefit analysis here? But again, I think there's scope to do a lot more research on some of these topics and questions and see if we can identify similar patterns or divergent patterns when it comes to international and internal migration. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Neha. Just before, I think if Kun is still there, you want to pose your question if you're still there. Otherwise, if you have any comments, I'm also talking to my own colleagues who have participated in the program and also provided comments and feedback to the report. Particularly, I'm thinking of my Sunita and Anne and others who are there. I mean, if you have any other comments to mention, please go ahead. So starting with Kun. Are you there? I have to invite him to the panel system. How does this work? To ask a question. Yogi, can I ask you to invite Kun to the panel?
I think he has been, yeah.
He has been, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, and then there's two also participants who have raised their hands. I think there's Rokeya Kabir and one more person, which we will cover. So okay. Over to you, Kun.
To me?
No,
Kun,
sorry.
Kun.
Yeah, Kun, I think is just rejoining as panelist. So if you give him a couple of seconds, I think he'll be back.
Okay. He's here now. Kun is here.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm here. Hello, Yogendra. How are you? Hello, Neha. Hello, everybody. Jens, Alpa, Igor. Yeah, well, I mean, very briefly, although I'm not entitled to speak on India and the Middle East formally, what I just highlighted in the chat is that from an ILO side, we always have the options for unions to submit observations, complaints with the ILO supervisory procedure to highlight violations of ratified conventions. Now, all this may not have a huge impact because, you know, we cannot invade India or Jordan when labor rights are being violated, call Putin or Biden to put a little bit of material on that, on these matters. But at least, you know, we have the options to open dialogue with governments on violations where we feel that these are unacceptable and everything that you have been presented is unacceptable. We have done this in the past in India, for instance, on manual scavenging. And it in fact led to a project that we did, which ran for 5 years. So, I mean, although I mean it is not a magic wand, it is an option for unions, even when they're not registered. And you know, for Jordan, I also try to keep to highlight this issue when I hear about all the atrocious violations against migrant workers. You know, even when unions are not registered, or unions from other countries, or the international unions can take up this action. And again, I don't expect too much from the ILO, but at least it is one instrument that we can use to draw attention to governments saying things are terribly wrong, please try to correct something. That's all I wanted to say, and thank you for the opportunity and for the interesting presentation and also for making me feel at home again. Bye.
Thank you, Kun. Thank you. Very good to see you again. Over to you, Rokeya.
Thank you. It was very interesting to know about the situation in India and Bangladesh and Nepal. And to me, the structural thing, as the question came in, this how colonialism have impacted, because all the rules and regulation, laws, everything, still we are following, you know, the inherited from British, and just it is going through improvisation, and still we are not. Two things. One is the mindset. Our education system is still colonized. And also, you know, in Europe and America, also the education, the way common people understand their education are also till now that they are, you know, colonial power by exporting money, exporting technology. They don't want any migrant worker in Europe or America, but they try to export capital and machinery, or you know, subcontract, and I should say subcontract and exploit the cheap labor, and the kind of development they want, so that they can create market in the in these former colonies to sell their product using using cheap labor from here and cheap things, and resell it in the you know, these former colonies. So that dynamics we need to understand to dismantle. We cannot you know, change history, but we can learn from the history, and we have to find out ways out how to unlearn the old things and relearn the new processes which are equal to colonialism, equal to slavery. That is what I want to, give my, observation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruqayya. We also have here Teresa, who has also published for us several very interesting reports, some of which were quoted in the report, and even Jens alluded to, particularly the report from Oman regarding and the reference regarding recruitment agencies in Oman. So over to you, Teresa. I know that you mentioned, what is it that we can do to try to, as an international organization, to try to take into account discrimination of other particular groups like the Rohingyas and others. But maybe you can expand on the question as you would. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Igor. I got up very early. I'm in Montreal, so for me, I started at 4 o'clock in the morning, but got mixed up on the timing at which you would start. Thank you very much. This is really a fascinating presentation. I was reflecting on some issues. Yes, you spoke very little. I'm linked to Bangladesh. You spoke little about Bangladesh, but it doesn't matter. We learn a lot about India. I think that, that in my own work on migration, there was a plan to study Bangladeshi working illegally, in quote, in India. We had to drop that because politically it's just impossible to look at these issues nowadays. 15, 20 years ago, I did work in Bombay. We worked in Uttar Pradesh, and it was possible to study this population. Now the political climate is such that we have to let it go. In Bangladesh, I think that we have presently, it's not part of the WIF program, but we have the problem with the Rohingya population, which the government of Bangladesh does not allow to work. And they are confined into these camps. I mean, people do find work, they skip out, but it's that such policy it really leads to tremendous problem. I mean, it increases the risk of trafficking, of huge exploitation. And with the Rohingya, it's nothing new. It started before. We looked at the Rohingya 7 years ago, and it started before the last influx in, I think it's 2016. So I think it's interesting to look at these illegal migrants. The Indian government considers Hindu as mostly as refugee and Muslim as illegal. So there is a criteria of religion there in understanding, giving a different rationale to these migrants who are often economic migrants. So one could go on and on and on. Thank you very much for that presentation. It was really, and Neha, thank you very much for the very important point you made about women. I mean, my work has been mostly on women. And so, discrimination starts within the family. I mean, there are so many layers to that discrimination. So I don't know what international organizations can do and government can do to address this. The recognition of migrant women as workers and with dignity and respect. There's a lot to work on. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Teresa. I think the point you bring out about both points, but also on the Rohingya is very important. We could have also mentioned in this part of the world where I am, also, for instance, Palestinians, Syrians were excluded from certain labor market opportunities in the country, particularly, for instance, in Lebanon, but also in other countries. So the whole issue of refugees, how is it that refugees, beyond just Rohingyas or Palestinians, how is it, the working rights of refugees is something which is very important. That is a significant gap. To know, of course, that this was not the topic of the report. I think much more could be said. I mean, it would be another publication to look into this. But I thank you for raising this point. I think Sunita mentioned. Sunita, from our colleague from Jordan, mentioned had a question regarding migration from Andhra Pradesh. I think it's that Neha had mentioned, but I think it's primarily around in certain districts like East Godavari and West Godavari, where you have a significant migration of Dalits and Muslims that go particularly to places like Kuwait. So you have a caste marker, and you also have a district marker, and in Kuwait particularly, you find there's not only in Kuwait, of course, but you do have this representation of workers who are there, and they're not the only ones. But I think there's more than just the economic side. There's a social aspect, of course, that is there. Now, I don't know if we're missing any more questions, or if anybody would like to say anything else before we close. I think we've just reached the end right now, but if there's some last minute comment or question, we can always invite you to the panel to say a few words.
Igor, I think there is one question.
Oh, there is? Okay, then I forgot.
Yes, so it's a question by Raisa Philippe, who's thanking us for the presentation, and then she's curious about our thoughts on the conflation of trafficking and migration for domestic work in South and West Asian regions. So I don't know if you'd like to respond to that, but I mean, while we think about it, I just wanted to also highlight two things. One issue, that Sunita was raising, which is that despite the coastal region in Andhra Pradesh being extremely resource rich, right, you still see very high levels of migration. And I think that's really a point to make, because in a lot of areas, one would imagine that resources are limited, there are lack of job opportunities, et cetera, which then push workers to migrate. But we also see this conundrum where we see resource-rich areas, where we again see very large numbers of people migrating. So I think there are issues around caste and social hierarchy, which perhaps could be greater driving factors than economic compulsions in some of these decisions which workers make, when they choose to migrate. Just on Theresa's point, and I just wanted to say it's really interesting, because we have, in the case of women, I think coming out of the household to be able to access paid work, the trafficking discourse, and I think I'm partially trying to also respond to what Raisa is saying, asking is that in the trafficking discourse, the assumption is that women are safe at home, right, or safer at home. But we know this for a fact through our interviews and meeting lots of trade unionists and organizers, that a lot of women are actually escaping social stigma, being single, not having space in society, and extremely, I think, problematic household relationships, right, by migrating. So it's also an escape out of a situation which is not conducive for women to be able to be themselves and exercise their full potential. So that is, I think, is really important. So somewhere when we talk about domestic violence in households, and we talk about these larger public discourses around women and mobility, I think we need to link these two. And I don't think there's enough of that taking place, Therese. So it's definitely food for more thought. And I think hopefully in the coming few years, we will be able to link some of these issues better, taking off from what the Work and Freedom Program has been trying to do. And just to also just quickly respond to Raisa and say that, I find it really interesting. Why is it that when it comes to women, we start talking about trafficking when they move for work, but for men, we don't necessarily use that framework, right? What is it about, what is so unsettling about women migrating for work that puts them within the trafficking discourse? The fact of the matter is, whether it's a traffic victim or a migrant worker, they all talk about aspirations. They talk about, the need or the desire to earn better, make a better life out of for themselves and their families as motivating factors. It's the process and I think where they end up, right, which then determines whether the migration framework will be used or the trafficking framework will be used. And instead of using them interchangeably in the case of women, I think to use a more agential sort of perspective is really important. So while, of course, trafficking is problematic, and maybe using the discourse to talk about better working conditions, the fact that a lot of these sectors and a lot of women workers don't really have good working conditions to deal with. If it puts the spotlight on that, then I think trafficking as a discourse is very useful. But I think the labor migration discourse is definitely more agential and gives more space to start talking about, you know, what the rights and entitlements of women workers should be, rather than what the right place for them to prosper should be. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thank you.
And taking it even beyond the labor migration discourse, I would argue that fundamental principles and rights at work are an even better way of framing and positioning this discourse, because it allows you to bring in the rights. Often in labor migration discourse, we tend to talk about the migration and less about the labor, and particularly the working conditions. So those fundamental principles are really important. And of course, it's not just the fundamental principles, the labor standards in general. I think we have exhausted the questions. I would like to take this opportunity to deeply thank all of you, particularly Alpa, Jens, Neha, my colleague who wasn't here, Miranda, with us, and all of you who also contributed to this report, who have not been mentioned, but some of you have been present, like Sunita, and we also have I think Suha was around, Anne was around with us. So thank you very much, and also thank you, Yogi, for the support, the IT support, and thanks also to our other colleagues who have invisible colleagues like Vinod and others who have participated in helping this come together. So with that, I will close this, but just before we close, I would like to say that we have a few more, before Work and Freedom ends, we do have a few more conversations happening. So we will be sending out information if you haven't received yet. We will be presenting a very interesting series of reports on paid and unpaid domestic work, particularly in the context of Bangalore and Chennai. We already presented this in Bangalore and in Chennai, but we'll be doing a broad online presentation, which will include colleagues from headquarters and from other parts of the world, and the colleagues from the Indian Institute for Human Settlements will be making that, including Gautam Ban and his team. So this one presentation, which I think is on the
19th.
Sorry, the 19th of January. We will be. You should have received it, but if you haven't, we'll forward it to you. And we will be having another presentation around the 8th of March regarding some of the work that we have done as well. So thank you very much for this, and thank you for colleagues who have joined. We look forward to keeping in touch. Bye-bye.